One of my favorite ships of all time is the GX1 short hauler. I don't know what makes this little yacht so enchanting, but it's high time we took a look at its design, specifications, and history. I'm Joey from Radio Free Coruscant, and this is the GX1 short hauler. Design. It's kind of hard to describe the shape of the Lantillian Shipwrights GX1 short hauler. It has a vaguely boat-like lower hull, topped with a rectangular shoulder section and a rounded cockpit at the front. It had two small wings just aft of center, which rotated to point backward for flight or upward on landing. These could be straight up and down or angled inward depending on the model. The purpose of these wings and their movement is unknown, but they may have been used to radiate heat or reconfigure the ship's shields. On top, more or less between the wings, the GX1 had a small dual laser cannon turret and its long-range communications array. At the rear of the ship were its four engines and what appear to be a radiator, some exhaust ports, and two short tails. The bottom of the ship held its landing gear, boarding ramp, and a docking port where a small escape craft was attached. This was more advanced than your typical escape pod with sublight engines and a hyperdrive rather than the typical navigation thrusters to simply guide it down to the nearest planet's surface. We have seen very little of the GX1's interior, just the cockpit and boarding pod room as far as I know, but we do know what else it may have inside. Different versions of the ship came with different interior configurations, and I imagine you could probably customize the interior as well. The GX1 was known to include a cockpit, captain, crew, and passenger quarters, a medical bay, a galley, an engineering room, cargo bay, and various entertainment options including a holo theater or zero-G relaxation chamber. You can find at least one official deck plan from Legends, and countless fan-made plans that better match the actual shape of the ship. I've always been very fond of this set, made by Reddit user Batgirl3, which includes both a highly detailed deck plan, as well as a cross-section and a couple of alternate variants. I also recently discovered this beautiful rendition by someone called Reign of Mythos, which appears less accurate but more detailed. I normally don't talk about deck plans, but these were both too good to pass up. Links to both will be in the description. There were several distinct variants of the GX1. The version I just described was the diplomatic shuttle variant, which was used by the Galactic Senate to transport senators all across the galaxy. There were also at least four other versions: a civilian yacht, a freighter conversion, a starbus, and a completely overhauled later model. As far as I can tell, the original civilian model of the GX1 was more or less identical to the diplomatic shuttle. It may have lacked the comms tower or turret, but does seem to have the escape ship. The freighter version was not an official model of GX1, but rather a common aftermarket conversion that could be done to any variant of the ship by stripping out its passenger amenities to make room for more cargo. The Starbus variant was a bigger departure from the original model. It featured much smoother lines overall, and the engine deck was covered with a large protective shroud. It had a different communications array on the top where the turret was on the original, and it lacked the boarding ramp at the rear of the ship with a cargo elevator in its place and a pair of airlocks embedded in its neck area instead that could be reached with boarding ladders on the ground. The interior was likely hollowed out completely with room for dozens of passenger seats and a cargo bay for their luggage. The cockpit was arranged slightly differently to allow the installation of an RX series pilot droid, though this was likely optional as the ship could still be flown manually. The Batgirl deck plans I mentioned earlier also include a lounge for passengers to hang out in flight with a minibar, holotables, and more comfortable seating, which I think would be a sensible inclusion to this version. The final official variant of the GX1 was by far the most unique. While it is canonically just the live-action look of the ship, it is such a radical departure from the aesthetic and even structure of the original GX1 that I can only conclude that it must be a different model. but it is still recognizable as a GX1, unlike, for example, the live-action YV-865, so it can't just be an entirely different class of ship. Therefore, whether you want to call it the GX2 or GX10 or whatever, we still must assume it is part of the GX1 ship family. I will get to the justification I came up with for the design change later in the history section. The final model of the GX1 had a much more organic and streamlined hull, almost like that of a miniature Mon Calamari cruiser. Most of its features were in largely the same place as the original model, including the radiators, turret, comms array, and wings. Its rectangular engines were swapped out for circular ones with a slightly different arrangement than the original. It didn't appear to have a cockpit window at the nose like on the original, but it did still have one on what would have been the escape pod. I like to think that they shook things up a bit with the design, and instead of wasting space with a redundant second cockpit for the escape craft that GX1 owners may never use, they just moved the cockpit for the whole ship down there and made the cockpit be an escape pod as seen on a few other ships. This freed up more space for larger living quarters or other rooms in the main hull. I like to think it now has the captain's quarters in the nose now, with perhaps a slim wraparound window just like the original cockpit windshield that is just too small to see in the few dark and blurry shots this variant appears in. In universe, the GX1 was designed by Lantillian Shipwrights lead engineer Shill Turvo. In real life, the design of the GX1 was based on concept art for the Lambda-class shuttle drawn by Nilo Rodis Jamero for Return of the Jedi in 1981. The GX1 was adapted from this drawing for Star Wars The Role-Playing Game in 1988, and further refined into the design we see today in The Clone Wars. The GX1 in turn went on to inspire the designs of the Polan 717 Jedi transport in The Acolyte, and the Darius G-class freighter in Resistance, both of which featured rear ends based on that of the GX1. The Polan is another Lantillian Shipwrights design, so it makes sense that it would look like the GX1. Though the Polan was created at least 100 years before the GX1, so I guess that's the other way around. The G-class resemblance is more interesting. While studying the ship to create this 3D model of it for a future video, I realized that the rear end of the ship is literally just copied from the GX1 and scaled up, with a few alterations like a second set of wings and engine shrouds, and larger engines. Obviously this is just a simple out-of-universe kit bash, but I like to think that the company Darius is related to Lantillian in some way. Either descended from it, owned by the same parent company, or something like that, and the ship designers who worked there ended up with a similar sense of style. Specifications. As far as I can tell, most of the specifications for the GX1 are the same regardless of version. It measured 37.3 meters long by about 17.8 meters wide and 14.5 tall when landed, 10.5 tall in flight, or 8.2 meters tall without the comms array and turret. It had a top speed of 800 kilometers per hour and a Class II hyperdrive. The escape craft it was equipped with measured about 6.4 meters long by 3 meters tall and 8.8 meters wide with its wings extended. I would think its top speed to be about the same as its motherships, and its hyperdrive to be a Class 2 or 3. It looked like it could carry 2 to 4 passengers, though more could fit if standing. The GX1 was armed with a double laser cannon turret for the diplomatic and updated variants, and unarmed for the rest. The ship's crew consisted of just a single pilot, which could be replaced with an RX series pilot droid to save money. The base model could carry 10 passengers, and the Starbus had seating for at least 12. There may have also been additional rooms for different passenger classes as well that we don't get to see in the episode this variant appears in. There's certainly room for it. The Star Commuter 2000 has seating for 24 passengers and is less than half the size of the GX1, so I would guess the Starbus should have at least that many. On top of the passengers, the GX1 could also carry 85 tons of cargo and 1 month of consumables. And at a cost of 85,000 credits new or 20,500 used, it was one of the best deals on the market. History. Very little is known about the history of the GX1. It was designed by Shill Turvo shortly before the Clone Wars, envisioned as an entry-level private yacht for moderately wealthy retirees and businessmen. It became one of Lantillian Shipwrights' most popular products, and eventually they began offering several options for customers to choose from. The Galactic Senate purchased a number of GX1 diplomatic shuttles, which they used to send delegates to various meetings across the galaxy. The shuttle Phoenix took a diplomatic envoy, including Ahsoka Tano, to negotiations on Mandalore, which she and Lux Bonteri used to escape in after things went awry. Bonteri hijacked the ship to travel to meet up with Death Watch to try to convince them to help him assassinate Count Dooku, and later stole the ship's escape craft to continue his mission. Another shuttle, the Valorous, took Senator Amidala and her envoy to a meeting on Scipio. This shuttle was eventually sold as surplus after the Civil War when the Empire retired the GX1 in favor of the Lambda shuttle and was converted into a starbus, which eventually ended up in a skirmish against some TIE fighters. Many other starbuses, both in the form of conversions like the Valorous and newly built ones straight from the factory, became a very common sight in transit hubs across the galaxy, especially in the Outer Rim. One was hijacked by Rebel Sabine Wren to smuggle a droid containing important information, though the shuttle had to be sacrificed to escape an Imperial Arquitens cruiser. The GX1 also remained very popular with independent operators for decades to come, with General Leia Organa taking one to Naboo shortly after the Battle of Endor, just in time to defend the planet from the Empire's Operation Cinder. At some point prior to 5 BBY, perhaps a couple years after the end of the Clone Wars, the GX1 short hauler received a major overhaul, making it much sleeker and more modern. As mentioned, it really reminds me of a Mon Calamari ship, specifically the MC-75 with its blend of traditional starship design elements and the Mon Calamari's aquatic aesthetic. Perhaps at some point Lantillian Shipwrights was bought out by Mon Calamari shipyards, who updated the Lantillian ships to match the style and technology of their own vessels. Lantillian was bought out by Tag Co. in Legends, so it's certainly plausible. The Mon Calamari version of the ship continued to be quite popular as well, with one being seen in use as a starbus on Coruscant a few years before the Battle of Yavin, and another for sale at Zorby's shiplot on Ferrix. Several Mon Cal-style GX1s even went on to fight in the Battle of Exegol around 35 years later. And that is everything there is to know about the GX1 short hauler. This is one of my favorite ships in Star Wars, and I've been looking forward to covering it for a long time. I had a lot of fun modeling the different variants of the GX1, though it was quite a lot of work for one ship breakdown video, so expect to see them in a few more list videos than usual in the future to make it worth the investment. But anyway, let me know which version is your favorite, and what you think of the GX1 overall. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week. RFC, out.